All right. Well, welcome everybody. My name's Mark Powell. I'm one of the founders of T or Transforming Education Australasia or tea.org.au. T is an umbrella group whose collective voice aims to advance the work of learner-centered, democratic, progressive, and alternative education across Australasia, and to encourage conversations about educational choices. So to that end, I'd like to welcome the speaker for our first webinar. Dr. Rebecca English is a researcher, teacher, and mother whose work is concerned with parenting and education. She has an interest in the ways parents make choices for their children that align with their beliefs about family, parenting, and other factors. Her particular interest is in the choice of non-mainstream education and how these choices affect children's experience of agency and autonomy. Her work explores questions of how parenting practices and beliefs are enacted in families and how these practices and beliefs lead to parents making certain choices for their children. Rebecca asks questions about how families enact power and agency in their lived experiences and choices around education, health, and parenting. Rebecca qualified as a teacher in 1998 and has been teaching for 20 years. She has worked with a number of different schools, teaching in the senior secondary and middle school years. She currently teaches business curriculum, English curriculum, and integrated curriculum units at QUT in Brisbane. She is the editor of several books and a co-author of a recent publication, The Superwoman Myth: Can Contemporary Women Have It All Now? She continues to publish widely in academic and popular press. She's been interviewed for television programs such as The Project, ABC Mornings, and SBS Vice's short productions, as well as dailies, including the Sydney Morning Herald, Courier Mail, and various other publications. So we're really excited and very honored to have Rebecca with us to kick us all off.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Mark. I'd like to start off by acknowledging the Turrbal and Yagara people on whose land I am sitting today, and acknowledge whatever country you are on, and to say that these lands have always been places of teaching and talking about ideas, and to acknowledge the important role that non-mainstream education has for Indigenous young people who experience a lot of success, often in non-mainstream school. But tonight I am going to be talking about school can't or school refusal. It's, we're sort of between the two terms at the moment. And I think it's a very interesting time to be talking about school can't, because it seems to be quite a big topic. It's something that people seem to be talking really, they're very animated about it, which is wonderful. And for the first time, we're seeing even Four Corners reporting on school refusal. So let me start off by talking about what I'm going to talk about tonight. I'm going to talk mostly about the research, what it says, what this research is meaning for us, why now, why are we seeing much more of school can't now, and what can parents do often as a first step when they are starting to experience school can't with their children or young people. So I'm going to start off by showing a screen. I'm on the gram because I'm obviously old. If I qualified as a teacher in 1998, I must be quite old. So my students told me recently that Instagram is for old people, so I'll own being old on the gram. But recently, at the beginning of the year, I got this particular Instagram story. And it was talking about the US, obviously, because it's not an Australian publication, it's the New York Times. But they're talking about how school absences have exploded almost everywhere. And the really interesting part of this was this particular phrase here: our relationship with school became optional. And they were talking about post-pandemic and how things had changed with the pandemic. And they talked about how no issue has been as stubborn and pervasive as the sharp increase in student absenteeism, a problem that cuts across demographics and has continued long after schools reopened post COVID. Remembering we are 4 years after COVID and we are still talking about how COVID has affected our relationship with schools. So, according to this US data in the New York Times, an estimated 26% of public school students, and let's hang on to that idea of public school students because how are they learning and what are they learning, are considered chronically absent, um, up from 15% before the pandemic. So, it's almost doubled post pandemic. And chronic absence is typically defined in the US as missing at least 10% of the school year or about 18 days for any reason. So these young people are increasingly chronically absent. They've got a figure of around 26% of public school students. So that number, 26, and the change doubling post pandemic is interesting. And we'll see if it is repeated everywhere else. So here's an ABC News article also talking about school refusal, school can't, and they've said that it's shocking and is bigger than first thought. And in this ABC article, they talked about how more than 1 in 3 parents, or roughly 30% of parents, have experienced school refusal in the past 12 months. A Greens senator commissioned the survey, and she says that the scale of the problem is bigger than thought. And parents are saying that you have to address the stresses rather than tough love, which is usually the medicine that's doled out to parents when their child begins to show evidence of school can't. So this mother talks about her experience, Ms. Kerr, and she said he wasn't just refusing to go to school, he physically could not go to school, and tough love actually didn't work. It was endangering his health. And when we're talking about school can't, we're talking about not regular truancy. Regular truancy is something that we used to see back in the 90s or when I was at school in the earlier 90s and in the 80s about kids who just would like run away. And they're the kids, you think about, they're the ones who are like, being a nuisance. They're, I don't know, wandering the streets, they're hanging out in malls, they're not doing what they're supposed to be. This group, this school can't group, is a really different group of young people. Her experience was that you had to address the stresses that accumulated to the point where the child was actually really, really anxious. He had to have therapy. They had to rebuild trust and heal their relationship. And after that, her son was able to get back on track with some time in distance ed, followed by a move to a private school. And he just finished grade 12. According to School Can't Australia, which has at that time 10,000 members, this is a little old now, this story, 75% have a disability or are neurodivergent. So they're saying that attendance problems are linked to a lack of inclusivity in the education system. And again, let's think back to that story from the US. We're not talking about the whole education system here. We're talking about a specific type of education. So here's another story about it. The Greens commissioned a poll of 1,000 Australian parents and found that 39%, 40% roughly, had said that their child had been unable to attend school because of anxiety or stress. And the breakdown for public and private schools was 41% public and 35% respectively. So now we're thinking back to that US data where there was 26%, and we can see it's actually a bigger problem here. The senator said that polling shows that school can't is not simply a niche phenomenon experienced by a small minority of kids. It's actually a major problem impacting hundreds of thousands of families across the country. So this is some data from the US, and it looks at that it's tracking school can't or school refusal. Or school distress, as we'll see, it's called a number of different names in the literature over time. And we can see that back when I was at school, my husband is a classic school can't. He used to run away from his very nice private school in a very nice suburb of Brisbane. And one time he talks about how his mother had to bribe him to come back to school. And if he stayed for a fortnight, he could have Beast Man, who was this He-Man figure that he desperately wanted. So somewhere around 1987, 1988 was when he was getting Beastman, and we could see that that was about the time that school refusal was starting to track up in the US as well as here. So let's keep looking at some more of this data. So this is some UK data. The percentage of children and young people is on the side. SD here stands for school distress. Students with school distress currently have extremely negative impacts of school attendance on their mental health. Roughly 55% of them experience that. But even with past school distress, where they do wind up back at school, they're still finding that 35% of them are having extremely negative impacts of school attendance on their mental health. So it doesn't really matter whether the child is currently experiencing school can't or is currently experiencing school distress. When we put them back into school and we force them to go, regardless of whether they appear to have passed that time in their lives, they're still having quite negative experiences and impacts on their negative health, on the mental health, sorry, in school. We see that when we look at the third part of the graph here, where there's no school distress, and most of the children are reporting a somewhat, very, or extremely positive impact of school attendance on their mental health. So it's a completely different experience for these young people. In this study, they identified that significant emotional distress with school attendance problems was associated with attendance. Um, they use the term school distress to replace school refusal because they argue that school refusal actually reinforces the idea that the child is just being naughty or silly or a problem for their parents. For this study, the defining feature of this group of young people's experience is not a refusal to attend school, but really it's an actual emotional distress that they experience when they attempt to go to school. They also talk about how there's a period of time usually associated with school refusal, and their argument is that school distress continues even if the child is turning up at school. They're not distressed just because they are attending school. So they think that for them, oh, sorry. So the school refusal label captures nothing of the emotional distress suffered. And that's why Australian groups call themselves school can't, because they're not refusing. They literally are emotionally distressed, anxious, and just cannot go. So in this particular study, they found some very interesting data. So the onset of school distress generally occurs in the formative years, so prep 1, 2. And the difficulties continue throughout the child's cycle at school. They also argue that it's generally associated with mainstream school provision. While it's not restricted to mainstream, it appears much more common in children and young people whose educational journey originates in a mainstream school setting, which they say poses the question whether mainstream settings are suitable for all children and young people, and if not, which other forms of provision may actually be more appropriate. And I think what's really interesting about this data is, as I will talk about later, mainstream is posited as both the solution to the problem, but also they are the problem. So I think that's what we really need to be coming to terms with in the school can't space is we talk about mainstream like it's the be all and end all, the only real way to do school. But if it is causing problems, then perhaps other alternatives are much more suitable for children and young people with school distress. Interestingly, they didn't find any difference among boys or girls, male or female identifying students. And they even found that non binary and transgender students had the same sort of problems with school can't as students who identified with the sex they were assigned at birth. But what they did find was that school distressed young people were significantly more likely to be neurodivergent than any child or young person without school distress. So if we think about what we're seeing here, school can't, otherwise known as school refusal, is increasing in Australia and also around the world, and not just the Western world, most countries in the world. Here in Australia last year, there was an inquiry and there was also a survey, and the inquiry reported fairly recently, and the Senator asked their constituents about it. What we know from all of this data is the prevalence in Australia is increasing, that current approaches are not working to solve the problem. And I would question whether the word problem is the right way to frame school can't as well. I wonder if it's not just another way of approaching school, but that's another story. And Naomi Fisher has done a lot of work to argue that in no way should we be forcing these school distressed young people back into school. And there are lots of other things that we can do. Most of them are not about forcing them back into mainstream school. We know there's a lot of hand wringing and pearl clutching in the popular press about it leading to an economic and social crisis. Often it's reported about how much it costs parents, the kind of impact it has on parents' time, but also like how much it costs the economy. It costs the economy when schools have to chase down these so called truant young people. It costs the economy because parents need to find other ways of having their children looked after while they're working. There are lots of issues economically and socially, but we do need to think about how we frame these up. We know that it isn't truancy. We know that it's always existed. I told you about my husband and Beastman. So, it's something that's been around at least since the 80s, although my cousins who are older than me will tell you that they also used to run away from school. And it seems to be connected to neurodiversity. And significantly in the research, it's almost universally said to be in response to an experience in mainstream school. Starts early, starts in mainstream school, and continues if they go back to mainstream school. So, what do we do at the moment? When we have a kid who presents as school can't, what do? We often force them to return to mainstream school, or we say that mainstream schools say, look at the parent and they go, actually, you're being a bit of a problem. Maybe there's some other school that would work for you. Or I've heard stories of parents being given the paperwork to homeschool, slid across the desk and asked, well, maybe that's the place where you should go to start from here because we can't help you, is often what is said. Mainstream schools generally approach school can't with the belief that you can microdose mainstream school as a kind of way to inoculate against it. So in New South Wales in particular, often a period of time in a distance ed school, as the story earlier suggested, will be suggested, or a little time in homeschooling. They'll make the process of homeschooling registration easy for you. And then with a view to you doing it for a term, maybe two, and then you slowly reintegrate back into that school or a different school. Alternatively, they tend to approach it from a homeschool as partial solution, where they're asked to homeschool for a time, they return to mainstream school, or maybe then they experiment with other schools. Like I said, New South Wales is the best known for taking this approach. However, there's no evidence that these approaches actually work to reduce or ameliorate school refusal because they're focused on returning the child to that place that has caused the problem in the first place, a mainstream school. And we know from the research that mainstream school is the place where it's starting, it's the place where it's most likely to be coming from. So that's what we know about the research. So the current approach focusing on returning to students to mainstream school is problematic because it's not truancy. There is absolutely no evidence these children are bombing trains when they aren't at school. They aren't sitting in the gutter chucking rocks at cars. They're not doing any of these things. But there is enormous pressure on families to get kids back to the school they left or another like it, in particular because of the impact on parents' work. And I mean, it's a cost of living crisis. Parents have to work. So some solution needs to be found. But we need to understand that when children are presenting with school can't, it's not actually bad behavior, even though that's how it's often couched in popular press. Many young people who are school refusing also had parents who refused school. So there's some intergenerational trauma there. There's also a pattern with neurodivergence where it's highly heritable. If one of your parents or grandparents is neurodiverse, then the chance of you or your children being neurodiverse is much higher. So it tends to be that kind of intergenerational experience. I mean, my kids refused school and I'm not buying them Beastman every 2 weeks. Young people aren't just saying no out of spite. They generally have a visceral physical and psychological reaction to going to mainstream school. It's not that they're being naughty. They really just cannot go. I think the other thing that's really interesting is that teachers are also increasingly leaving the classroom and refusing to go to school, but no one ever accuses them of school refusal. So I think there's a really strong element of this understanding about agency, there's understanding about the capacity of people at different stages of their lives to make choices. and their ability to articulate what those choices are. A preppy who is really anxious is not able to express themselves like a teacher who says, look, honestly, this is too much for me. And I think this is where we really get into sort of the nub of the issue. Because if mainstream is both the problem and the solution, what does that say about the current capacity of the resources that we have to deal with the phenomenon? And I think when you look at this phenomenon, we need to think about it in terms of the three sort of levels. At the micro level, for the child, there is maybe an experience of bullying. Maybe there's an experience of them struggling to learn a particular topic. Maybe the uniform is itchy. Maybe they don't want to wear it. Maybe they'd like to get up and walk around and they're not really allowed to. But then there are like the middle range, the meso issues. So maybe they're just really not connecting with curriculum the way it's being presented. Maybe the syllabus is moving too fast. Maybe they're in a mainstream school in Queensland and it's a C2C school. So they're having to follow the C2C pattern, and that maybe that just doesn't work with how they learn. And the other meso issue too might be the way that the school deals with other behaviors in the classroom. Maybe the classroom is really noisy, but the school doesn't really concern themselves with that. But sitting on top of that are the macro issues. And look, maybe the macro issues are that we've moved on. Like, I joke about my husband in the 80s and Beast Man, but we don't live in a world like the one that I grew up in. When I was a child, if you refused school, you really were naughty and nobody listened to you. And the punishment for that was you often got a smack, or your parents ignored you for weeks at a time because you really, you're fine, go to school was the mantra. So maybe some of the macro issues are that we don't parent the way that our parents parented us. And the world isn't the same as the world of the 80s and 90s. We don't live in that world anymore. So there's lots of issues at play here that we really need to sort of think about and unpack. And quite frankly, I feel like we're on a tanker and it's careening and we need to really turn the ship around, but we aren't really sure how or whether we can, in a mainstream sense, turn the ship around. So across the whole of the Western world, cases of young people withdrawing from school have increased. And there are many alternatives that parents can access when mainstream is not working, has not worked, won't work for your particular young person. And at this point, I would direct everybody to the T website, where, as Mark said in the introduction, there are lots of different groups represented who are able to provide alternative education settings that aren't mainstream, that will be maybe a better fit for your young person when they're experiencing school can't. Sorry, I have a chest infection and I honestly sound like I smoked 7 packs of Winnie Blues before I started this, and I promise you I didn't. Um, but one of the first places that parents turn to when they're experiencing school can't is homeschooling. So we saw in that Four Corners, if you watched that Four Corners, there was a lot of talk about parents bringing their children home and keeping them at home when they wouldn't go. And so they would try to take them to school and then the child could not go in. So they would bring them back home. I would say from the outset, as somebody who researches homeschooling, that is actually not homeschooling. So I'm going to talk a little bit about homeschooling, what it means, what it involves, and a little bit about distance ed. But I think that the next presentation in the T series will be talking a bit more about some of those school choices, but I don't think we're going to talk about homeschooling. I would also say that I understand that homeschooling is not often the preferred term, but when I am applying for grants, I'm always trying to keep my words down. So I use the word homeschooling. So please understand that what I actually mean is education without schools. So let's talk a little bit about what homeschooling is. So, homeschooling is generally defined as children educating outside of formal institutions like schools. Parents of home educated children are wholly responsible for facilitating their child's learning. I would hasten to add that formal institutions does not mean they do not do any formal instruction. Homeschooled or home educated children generally do a lot of the same activities that their conventionally schooled peers will do. If your kid is mad about soccer, then learning soccer, having one-on-one coaching with a specialist soccer coach, playing for an academy soccer team is still a formal education, but it's facilitated by the parents. Similarly, if your child is a violinist and has instruction in violin with a violin teacher, well, yes, that is a formal instruction, it is not a formal institution. With home education, we need to think about what's called the locus of control and the locus of education. Always the locus of control is the parent because they are the one that does the registration requirements. They meet the educational requirements of the department, but the locus of education is everywhere, all around. That's where homeschooling isn't really about home. It's the home is also as problematic as the term school. So home education is legal across the entire country. Every state or territory has a different requirement, but they all require parents to register with the department in some form. There have been reports that more students have registered for home education because of the pandemic. Um, this is not necessarily correct. It was actually rising prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic was like a shot in the arm to homeschooling. It really blew up the numbers because it was at that time that people got to try it for themselves. They had a what I called a risk-free trial during COVID and saw what was possible, what was happening in classrooms, what was really going on, what their child was experiencing for the first time. And I think it changed our relationship with schooling. It became optional, as we learned from that article at the beginning. The official data says there's somewhere around 43,000 home educating young people in Australia. I think this number is much lower than the reality. New South Wales numbers are around 13, 14,000, but they're reducing. The numbers are going down. I don't necessarily think that reflects a reduction in the numbers of home educating young people. I think that reflects a reduction in the numbers of home educating young people who are registered with the department. Similarly, I'm in Queensland. We have about 10,048 legally registered homeschoolers in Queensland, but advocates here estimate that's only maybe 20, maybe 50% of the population of homeschoolers. So there's a lot of young people kicking around the traps who are home educating, who aren't able to be captured in this official government data. Northern Territory doesn't collect data terribly well, so it's hard to say in the Northern Territory. And Western Australia reports differently because their districts collect data on how many home educators, but it's roughly, the official data is roughly somewhere around 43,000. So you're reading that and you're thinking, but isn't that like distance ed? And I would say no, and most homeschoolers would be aghast. Distance ed is not homeschooling. With distance ed, the child is actually enrolled in a school and they are taught by a teacher who delivers the content remotely. Perhaps they have to sit there on a laptop all day, perhaps part of the day, perhaps one day a week. Perhaps they're given work to do at home, but always the locus of control isn't the home, it's a school, and the locus of education in distance ed becomes the home. So it's a really different experience and very much one that's controlled by an outside entity or force. It's not the parent who gets to decide. So how do I enroll in homeschooling? Well, that depends on where you are across the country, as each state and territory works out their own enrollments. They do that because technically school education is a state responsibility, even though it's funded, private schooling is funded by the federal government, and roughly 20% of state schooling in each state is funded by the federal government. They don't ever give them their full 20%, but them's the breaks. And each state has a different process, different procedures in different areas of their education department where you do enrolment. It's usually granted for a year or perhaps two in New South Wales. Parents have to prepare some sort of plan and provide some evidence of learning. If you're in New South Wales, an AP or an authorised person will come to your house and they will sit down. They cite your child, but they don't actually have to have a conversation with the child. And you talk to them about what you want to do for the year, some of the learning experiences you're going to have. In Queensland, you have to produce a report at the 10-month mark. They ask you to report on literacy, English, numeracy, maths, and one other subject area of your choice. You can produce samples of your child's work, but in Queensland, you have to provide what's called a high quality education, which you argue for, and you have to show progress across the 12 months of learning. However, that progress works for your child. If you don't produce some kind of sample, then the parent's narrative about the child's learning journey is sufficient, but it's really important in Queensland that you show progress. So, how do I do it? It's really important if you decide to go down the homeschooling route that you access support services. And there are lots of different groups around the country that you can join. HEN is a Victoria based body, but they do work around the country. There's a Sydney Home Ed Network, and they do help in the ACT and Tasmania. The HEA is a national body. It's the Home Education Association, and it provides lots of advice and support for home educators. Home Education Queensland is a Facebook group, but it's very well monitored, and lots of advice and lots of sample plans if you're trying to do the Queensland plan. Queensland's actually a little tricky to register in because they are, I don't know how to describe them politically, um, fun to work with. And there's a new group called Free to Homeschool who've started in Queensland, but they are offering a national service. They've started in the wake of an amendment bill we had in Queensland, which was recently overturned, where the government decided to try and make homeschooling even harder to do. But all of those support services provide advice to parents on how to start, how to write a plan, how to report, and also how to cope. They're like the school gate for homeschoolers. I cannot strongly enough recommend that people access services that help them. Facebook is your friend. Young people coming to homeschooling from school can't often find that time for deschooling is essential. Deschooling is when we take some time away from any kind of forced educational activities and we just sit. Your child might actually just need to sit and stare at a tree for a while, or might need to go and run around at the park or at the beach or with their dog or any of these things. You work with those groups and they will help you to find ways around needing to produce really academic style plans and academic style reports. And you can see how, even with deschooling, there's lots of educational experiences that young people have. When we think about homeschooling, it's very philosophical. It tends to exist on a spectrum. At one end is highly structured. It looks like distance ed. It's much more school at home. Perhaps you are buying those paces and you're working through those for all of the subjects. At the other end is much more unstructured. So the highly structured end will hold curriculum and pedagogy as the center of what you do, but highly unstructured is going to hold the child's interest as the center. So school at home is what we generally think of when we think about highly structured, and then unschooling at the other end is what we generally think about when we think about sort of more unstructured educational approaches. And unschooling really is homeschooling where the child is at the center of what you do. You don't have a curriculum document that you're trying to meet. You can back map onto what the child's done, links with curriculum if that's what you wish to do for reporting. But otherwise, it is easy to show progress in unschooling because the child will definitely lead the way. So to enroll in distance education, again, this is managed at state level. There are lots of, in Queensland in particular, there's like 3 state government run in distance ed schools. There's the Brisbane School of Distance Education, there's one in Charters Towers, and there's one in Cairns. But there are lots and lots of private ones, many religious, but also a non-religious one, which is called Pinnacle. And it mainly runs P to 6, but again, you can enroll in the other ones and take a non-religious pathway. Some states make it really easy to enroll in distance ed, while others make it really difficult. So in Queensland, if you're prepared to pay, it's reasonably easy to enroll in distance education. You just choose it like you would any other school. My understanding is that even some of the Catholic schools are trying to offer a distance education pathway. It looks like a school in Brisbane called St. John Fisher. It's currently an all-girls on-campus school, but it looks like it's moving toward a distance ed kind of model where they're billing through a school but offering remotely some of their classes. Other states, I'm looking at you, New South Wales, make it quite difficult and tend to try and restrict the practice to geographically or medically isolated students. Or those students who are school can't. It often is prescribed as a way to get young people back into school. But with both options, there is some funding available through what's called AIC, or the Assistance for Isolated Children payments. It's about $3,000, but it can help pay for a distance education school if your child cannot attend. And usually, a GP or a psych will need to make the assessment. But if your child is school can't, then there's no way that they are going to say that your child can go to school. So it's about missing a certain number of days because of a medical condition, such as school can't, anxiety, any of these things. So there is some funding available, but otherwise, you don't get any money for homeschooling or distance ed. So as parents, what can we do? I think with school can't, it can be really hard, but we do need to actually accept that our children are expressing a legitimate need. And maybe if us or our partner were school can't, it's probably not going to be that hard because we may well remember our own experiences of schooling. We may well remember our partner may well remember their experiences of schooling. So they are going to understand that it's a legitimate need. And often we'll have our parents, or maybe we might have our partner's parents on board because they too, I mean, that can be a double-edged sword, I suppose, because they just like force the kid back to school. But they will remember and understand and experience that this is genuine. This isn't something the child is doing just to be naughty. There really is a legitimate need that they cannot go. We need to do what we can to support them. So we may have to try and set up structures, ask for help where you can to support them. And we need to understand that trying to force them back into that classroom is not going to work. We need to explore our options, and that includes what other school types are available to us in our budget and in our geographical area, to look at ways that we can meet that young person's need outside of forcing them back into this mainstream school from which they are clearly quite distressed. And we need to understand that many of the experiences that led to them are going to take time to come out. So it may not be immediately obvious to us what it is that's caused this visceral distress that our child has. But, through time, things will be revealed to us, and we're actually going to have to try and find space to listen and empathize with our child. We may not agree that the experience that they had was enough to be like for them to have the reaction that they had, but we need to understand that for that young person, this was a massive thing that happened to them, and they need to express it and explain it to us. The most important thing is to create connections with other parents who are in the same boat. And I think Facebook groups and that school can't community are amazing. Those women are so dedicated and so brilliant, and they understand that these experiences are real. Their children have had them, they may have had them, and it's really important that we try and connect with some support groups. Um, the most difficult one is probably trying to educate your immediate circle about your child's needs. Any of us who have tried to go down an alternative pathway will know that there will always be some family member who makes it quite difficult, and tries to question you. My own mother talked about these dreadful experiments I was conducting on my children when I wasn't going to send them to the same elite private schools that my brother and I had attended. So I do understand that it's very difficult, and every single time I would talk to her, all I would hear was about these dangerous experiments I was running with my children's futures. We need to accept that behaviors may result from their experiences, and how many times do we hear the teacher say that our child was amazingly behaved at school? I don't understand what you're talking about. And then they kick off at home. We need to understand that those behaviors are the result of them feeling safe with you and needing to express their feelings. And as I said in point 4, they may not have the language skills or the cognition yet to fully express what happened to them. So understanding and accepting that is really important. You need to find your tribe, and that goes back to finding connections with parents who are in the same boat. Read what you can to educate yourself, and it's really tempting to try and force, if it's, I'll use my mother as an example, to try and force your mother to read all the material that you're reading. But I'm sure your mother is nicer than mine, but that, in my experience, was a hiding to nothing. She refused to believe anything that I was showing her, but you can educate yourself. And we need to advocate where we can for our young person. I think you also need to steel yourself for questions. Family, and I think often they're legitimate. They really are just curious. What is your child going to do for university? Is one of the big ones you will get. Oh, but what if they decide to go back to school? Oh, but my friend's husband's brother's former roommate was doing this and they were fine. Yes, all the things. Our friends will also have questions and may find it difficult for us to understand, particularly if they are taking a different path to us. People in the local community may have questions, librarians, although less so, particularly now as homeschooling has become so popular. But often it's people in shops as well, like the people serving you at the butcher are often the ones you get the weird questions from. Now, the school may hassle you to return your child. And I think we need to understand, particularly if you start down the homeschooling route and they did not necessarily support that, that quite a lot of the time, they just want to make sure that your child is okay and safe, and they have a different view of education to you. So understand that it's usually from a place of kindness and care, but you have a right to homeschool, and there are lots of people who can provide you with letters to help you get them off your back. And then there are always the randoms. My favorite ones are the randoms I never expect, like the old lady in IKEA recently who asked me why my children weren't at school, and then decided that she needed to educate me on why my children were better off in school. And I just let them go. That's clearly, she's obviously got some sort of need that she needed to meet in that moment. So whatever, lady, you have your say. And now I'm done. Does anybody have any questions for me? And I'll stop the share because as beautiful as my thing is. Oh, this QR code, Gabrielle would like me to tell you, links to the T website. So please click on that if you want to go and have a look at the T website, which is beautiful and amazing. Thank you very much, everyone.
Rebecca, thank you so much for sharing your expertise.
I
Everybody,
sound awful. I'm so sorry, Mark. I sound dreadful.
we'd like to invite discussion and questions. So if you have a question or a comment, you can raise your hand using the one of the options at the bottom of your screen. And I'll spotlight members of the T organization so that we can take some of those questions.
I must have answered everything that everyone wants to know.
Mark, in the conversation in the chat, it turns out we have an incredible visitor from Japan.
Oh.
Kajiki Asakura runs a democratic university for school refusal students, and they have home-based education networks. Some of us wouldn't mind hearing from him.
Okay. Well, welcome.
Hello.
Hello.
May I talk
Yes,
a little bit?
please.
Thank you very much for very interesting presentation. Actually, in Japan, we have many school refusing children. We have 300,000 school refusing children at compulsory education level, and school refusal has been one of the, how to say, central kind of a issue of education longer than 40 years. And personally, I have studied school refusal longer than 30 years. And, we have many problems about Japanese education, but school refusal is very, how to say, symbolic phenomena in education. As we understand, school refusing children are not a problem. But the phenomena has many, how to say, implications and so on. In late 1950s, child psychiatrists pointed out that's a huge problem. Even though the children do not have a problem of poverty or physical handicaps and so on, and then they do not attend school. So that's a problem. So since 1966, Japanese Ministry of Education started to take a record. So every single number of school refusing children are counted since 1966. So always we paid attention to the number of school refusing children. So the number has been increased even now. And at the beginning, school refusing is the central issue about primary school and the junior high school. But nowadays, approximately more than 3% of junior high children experience school refusal. But nowadays, we mention about school refusal at senior high, university, even in graduate school. And we also have a very big issue that is hikikomori. I don't know, you may have heard of it or not. In some European countries like France, Italy, United States, they also share the same problem. I have contacted with scholars of Paris Fifth University. They have a team about it. In Japan, we have a 1.5 million population of hikikomori. They are staying at home without going out. So some of them are in their teenage, the others are in their 20s, 30s, even 40s, and so on. So it's huge issue in Japanese society. Maybe I talk too much, but I want to talk a lot of things with you, with you all.
Kageki, I'd love to get your details and actually have a conversation with you about, in particular, hikikomori, because I think that's a really fascinating situation. And Cecilia, was Kageki at a conference of ADEC? We met once, I think, at an ADEC conference, yes?
Yes. It's lovely to see you. So glad you could come.
Yeah. Thank you, Cecilia.
Yeah. And, I thought, I knew about Kageki's work in this area, and I thought it would be very significant if he could join us, particularly because he's been doing such positive work with kids who have gone through this, for a long, long time. And at the stage of creating a university where they can really, keep learning and keep, so it's been a very special thing, really. Yeah.
Natalie, did you have a question?
No, just I was just really, it's just agree with everything that Rebecca said, really. We've been on that journey for the last 12 months. And it's just, it's so frustrating. I know this is all coming out now, and just interested in terms of research, because obviously the research and the evidence is always going to back up movement. But it just seems that the educators just aren't listening to the research that's coming out. So it's just, very frustrating as an educated parent. So, but unschooling is, unschooling is really working for us, and we're making slow progress. And
where are you, Natalie?
home education. I'm in Melbourne.
Okay.
And so the Home Education Network have been absolutely unbelievably amazing. The volunteers there, and School Can't as well have been a fabulous organisation and super supportive. So we've been fairly lucky, but it's not easy. So.
No, and I mean, it's hard too, because you have to, you go into this thinking that you take them to school on the first day, there's the photographs, there's a little chalkboard, there's the things, and then it isn't what you were promised. And I think you need to understand too that frustration is really normal and natural and a big part of what
Yep.
you're experiencing. So I think that's really great. And thank you for sharing. And you're right, HEN do amazing work, and School Can't Australia do amazing work. And it's really important that we understand that. And yeah.
Yep. So thank you all for, keep up the evidence and the pushing the authorities. So thank you.
Thanks.
Does anybody else have a question or a comment? If you do, you can raise your hand using the reactions at the bottom of the screen.
I think Rachel Leslie has something too. She raised her hand, like for real.
I did. I tried finding the reaction button and I just couldn't do the digital hand raising. Sorry.
Okay.
I was really interested in what you were saying, Rebecca, about the approach that schools take. Now, I have been a school guidance counsellor. I am an academic and a researcher, and I'm also the parent of School Can't kids as well. So it's kind of seeing it from all angles. But I know that when I was in the role of school guidance counsellor, I could see the writing on the wall. You know, we can't physically drag a student into school, and it's causing the child distress, it's causing the parent distress. And so my approach was, well, here's all the information that you need to do homeschooling or distance ed. Here's how to get the funding. Here's how to make the system work for you. And so it wasn't just a matter of, here's your information, off you go. I made sure that I supported that transition. And I don't, I agree with what you say. The problem is mainstream school. And it's a factory system that is just not working anymore. And somebody needs to realize that. But what do you feel is the role of school, a mainstream school, in trying to facilitate and support a family who is experiencing that? Because I think it's more than just trying to drag a kid in and sit them behind a desk. It's about trying to support the family through that as well.
I would say too, like I was mainstream schooled, and like I'm not gonna lie, I went to a really very nice elite private school. I hated every moment of being there, but I look back as an adult and I'm very grateful that I went. I can see all the advantages that accrued from having had that kind of an experience. And I think that for a lot of my friends and people I still know who I went to school with, they loved every moment of school. So I think that there are a group of people for whom mainstream is exactly where they ought to be. I also would say from the outset, I don't think this is a teacher problem. I think teachers are doing amazing work in their classrooms with what resources they have in front of them, often nowhere near enough. And we need to be supporting and understanding that teachers are doing it really tough. I think that if I could have a magic wand, I think that there's lots of amazing models of schooling that mainstream could implement that tend to work. So through Cecilia, I found out about an amazing school in New South Wales called Linfield Learning Village, and I went and visited, and it's much more flexible than a mainstream school, but it is in New South Wales, so it doesn't have that C2C that we have here in Queensland, which is curriculum to classroom, where everything is laid out for you, and you are, if we're on day 4 of term 3 maths, we do this activity. It's a New South Wales curriculum, so it's stages, not ages, and there are problems with New South Wales curriculum, but it is much more flexible than what we do. I think if you look, there are a lot of kids for whom Montessori works really, really well, and that's the right model for them. There are lots of kids for whom Steiner works really, really well, and that's the right model for them. And then there are lots of schools who are innovating with mainstream curriculum. All of the ADEC schools that Cecilia represents, all of them are doing amazing work. There is nothing to stop mainstream. Like in Queensland, you can go to a mainstream school and it is actually a Montessori school. So if you enroll in, I think it's Grovely, you can do the Montessori stream. So if we can do that, if Linfield can do what they do in New South Wales, if Templestowe can do what they do in Victoria, there's no reason that we can't have a lot of options for young people that work for them. And at the same time, there are busy schools and there are flexi schools and there are lots of different models. We need to open up that flexibility so that more young people can approach it. And
Can I add to that?
Yes.
So I'm a teacher in a Queensland education system, but I'm in a niche of a small school. And there are actually quite a few of these little niches starting to happen, almost on the sly, because we are square pegs in round holes. So the one I work for, which is just one example, and this school also has Montessori, by the way, and isn't Grovely, but it isn't Montessori perfect, but it's better than nothing. This one I work for deals with neurodivergent people and is for twice exceptional kids. And it's partly online, partly offline, and it's very relational and very flexible. And many of our kids have letters from doctors saying they don't have to do the whole ACARA, which is how come we get away with it. Yeah. So there are niches starting to happen. This is just one example of it, but they are hard to find. Mark, Tiffany has a hand
Yes,
up.
Tiffany.
Hi, Rebecca. Hi, everybody. I'm from School Card Australia, and thanks for giving us a shout out tonight.
Always, Tiffany, I think your work is amazing, and I'm in awe of what you people do with so few resources. So I would love to connect with you too. So can you put your email in tab so we can have a proper conversation?
I started writing you an email yesterday, and I thought, no, I'll listen to you speak first, and then I'll reach out. So yeah, thank you. I just wanted to add, I agree with everything you've said tonight. I think that I also work as a social worker, working with young people and their families who are struggling with school attendance difficulties. And I think that sometimes if we can identify the stresses and the barriers, and we can resolve those with a school, we can make mainstreams work for some kids. And I think that it can be really difficult, though, sometimes to identify those things. And sometimes our students are too distressed to tell us. Sometimes they need time out of school to have some perspective to be able to identify what those things were that were causing them stress. But I do believe that it is an experience of chronic stress and unrelenting chronic stress that often leads to school attendance difficulties, to distress about school. I've been working on designing a resource that I'm just about to launch called the Student Stress Investigation, which is a tool that I use to help identify stresses. And often I find that when we can give a school a list of what those stresses are, and we can then have conversations about how can we resolve these stresses, that we can make a difference for kids and change the environment for them so that it is more acceptable. My own daughter has something like 25 different supports and accommodations at her Catholic high school in year 10 in order to make school accessible for her so that she can attend. So it can be done. And sometimes it's just simple things, but I'm often surprised at how often our kids are struggling, our neurodivergent kids are struggling with some really basic things like feeling comfortable using the toilets or eating at school. And those are really basic human needs. And not to mention then all the sensory stuff. Lots of those things we can find solutions for, but if we don't know what those problems are, we can't. We just don't know what to do. Yeah.
Thank you, Tiffany. We're actually almost pretty much out of time, but maybe before we click off, would somebody like to talk about the other webinars that we have in the series? Gabrielle, would you like to mention those?
Yes, but they are also on the website that I've put on a few times, that tea.org.au webinars. At the bottom of that, they are definitely there. Jane, who's in the picture under me, and I are going to be doing a how to choose your own school. No, not how to choose your own school. That's a different one. How to choose a school that suits your child. Then it is followed by one that should be really interesting for teachers and people who teach kids, even though they aren't teachers. Because each of us that come from a different system are going to come with one strategy, if you like, call it trick, whatever, out of each of these different systems that you can apply in a mainstream school as a mainstream teacher without stressing out any of the other systems that are in there, that you can just use to create a better connection with kids and get them thriving. So that's number 3. I have put it up in the chat earlier. Let me do my cheat sheet. Then the third one is where each of the different groups like Montessori, Steiner, ADAC, which is the democratic school, maybe the nature schools, maybe some others that we are not quite finished signing up yet. Trying to find it now, can't find it. There. That one is where innovative and alternative schools are explained and people can ask questions. And then the last one is how and when not to start a school. Because there's quite a few of us that have experiences with starting a school. And that working in some ways or not. Peter Hutton is someone who has started, he hasn't started Temple Stowe, which is what Rebecca quoted, but he certainly led it on an innovative path. He's no longer there. He's revamping a different school, and he's hoping to set up a network around Melbourne, Gippsland. There are several people here that are indeed on the Facebook page that was mentioned earlier, the Start Your Own School. There is Bianca, who started the village school on the Gold Coast. There is Debbie, who's up in the near Cairns or thereabouts. Matilda might know more about that. Anyway, so this is the series that we're doing. We are all very busy professionals who are doing this because we really believe that thing of together we have a very strong voice and can influence a lot more. Cecilia in the middle there is particularly good at getting us to put in submissions to things that the government wants to know about. And so we do all sorts of things like that. Is that enough, Mark?
Yes. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you in future webinars with TEA. You can go to tea.org.au for more information about those webinars.
Well, particularly the webinar page also has a carousel on it with some extra information on the different school systems, if you like. There's a question from Rachel Leslie that Kajiki might want to answer in the text, in the chat.
It's okay, Gabrielle. I think the conversation's moved
What
on.
is the
Okay.
what is the portion?
All right. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Let's leave it there. Thanks again, Rebecca English. It was an honor to have you.
Thanks, Mark. It was lovely to be here. Thank you so much, everyone.
All right.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Good night.
And yeah, have a great night.
Yeah. Bye. Bye, Kageki.
Hi, Cecilia. Hi, Chris. Thank you very much for
Thanks,
joining
Jackie.
you.
Bye.